The alien princess was amazed by the human diplomat's bravery. HFY Sci-Fi Story. HFY Stories. The galaxy was vast, stretching beyond what any single species could fully comprehend. Among its many star systems, planets, and civilizations, the Zelnaran Empire stood out as one of the most powerful. A species of tall, noble beings with elongated features, their culture was built on strength, honor, and military might. For centuries, the Zelnaran had ruled over a vast expanse of space, their empire expanding across star systems. Their warriors were unmatched, their fleets of ships intimidating, and their technology advanced far beyond anything humans had imagined. But despite all their might, the Zelnaran Empire was in turmoil. Peace between them and the human colonies was fragile at best. The humans had always been a stubborn species, unwilling to bow to anyone. They had colonized planets across the galaxy, forming alliances and treaties with different species, including the Zelnaran. Yet, over the past decade, tensions had begun to rise. A series of resource disputes had escalated into full-scale conflict in some areas. The humans were determined to secure their place in the galaxy, while the Zelnaran felt their empire was being threatened by human expansion. Both sides had suffered losses, and peace seemed like an impossible dream. That's where Elias Darnell came in. Elias was a diplomat, a negotiator from Earth. His job was to bring peace where there seemed to be none. At 35, he was young for such a position, but his reputation had grown quickly. His calm demeanor, sharp mind, and ability to remain level-headed even in the most intense situations made him the ideal candidate for missions like this. His superiors knew that the stakes were high. If the peace talks with the Zelnaran failed, the human colonies would be thrust into war with one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. A war that could very well mean the end of human civilization as they knew it. The diplomatic shuttle carrying Elias landed in the capital city of the Zelnaran Empire, located on their homeworld, Zelnar. The planet was a marvel of advanced technology and culture. The buildings were sleek, made from a blend of metal and crystalline structures that shimmered in the light of the planet's two suns. The streets were lined with statues of great warriors and philosophers, each one representing the rich history of the Zelnaran people. Elias had visited many planets in his career, but Zelnar was unlike anything he had ever seen. The air felt thick with power, and the weight of history hung in every corner. He was about to meet the ruling class of an empire, and he knew the task before him would not be easy. As he exited the shuttle, a contingent of Zelnaran soldiers stood at attention, their sharp gazes fixed on him. Elias had seen their kind before, tall, imposing figures, with strikingly sharp features and metallic armor that gleamed in the sunlight. They were the elite warriors of the Empire, feared and respected throughout the galaxy. Their presence here wasn't just for show, it was a reminder of the power they commanded. He walked toward the palace, accompanied by his own team of human diplomats, keeping his composure despite the intensity of the moment. His heart raced, but he wasn't about to let anyone see it. He had a job to do, and nothing was going to distract him from it. The grand palace of the Zelnaran was an architectural wonder. Towering spires reached toward the sky, and the walls were adorned with intricate carvings that depicted the history of the Zelnaran people. Inside, the halls were vast and echoing, filled with statues of past emperors and warriors. The air was cool, and the scent of some unknown flower lingered in the air, adding to the sense of otherworldliness. Elias followed his guide through the maze of corridors, finally arriving at the throne room. The door opened, and he was led inside. At the far end of the room, sitting on an elevated platform, was the Zelnaran princess, Liara. She was everything Elias had imagined and more. Tall, regal, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Her hair, dark as the void between stars, was pulled back into an intricate braid that cascaded down her back. She wore a gown of silver and blue, shimmering like the surface of a calm ocean under starlight. Her presence filled the room, and Elias could feel the weight of her gaze as it settled on him. Princess Liara was the daughter of the emperor and the future ruler of the Zelnaran Empire. She was known for her intelligence and leadership, but also for her cold, unyielding demeanor. Those who had dealt with her in the past spoke of her as being more like a general than a princess, pragmatic, fiercely protective of her people, and often untrusting of those who were not of her kind. Elias was not just meeting a princess, he was meeting the future ruler of the Zelnaran. The stakes of this meeting were beyond anything he had faced before. If he failed here, there would be no peace. There would be no future for human-Zelnaran relations. Ambassador Darnell, Liara's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. It was smooth and cold like the steel of a blade. I trust you know the importance of this meeting. Do not waste my time with pleasantries. Elias bowed slightly, showing respect but not subservience. Your Highness, he replied evenly, I understand the gravity of this situation. My people are committed to peace, but we need the same commitment from your empire. We cannot afford war. Liara's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. You speak of peace, but your people continue to expand, continue to push into our territory. I do not trust the humans, Ambassador. You bring your soldiers, your ships, your demands. You think you can take what is ours and simply negotiate for it. Elias felt the tension rise in the room. He knew she wasn't just speaking for herself, but for the entirety of the Zelnaran leadership. But he also knew he couldn't back down. If he did, this meeting would be over before it began. We're not here to take anything, Elias said, his voice steady. We want to establish fair boundaries, trade agreements, and mutual respect. The colonies don't want war, and I believe there's a path forward if you're willing to consider it. For a moment, Liara said nothing. She simply regarded him, her eyes piercing through him, as though she were trying to read his very soul. Then, with a slight gesture of her hand, she motioned for him to come closer. I will give you one chance, Ambassador, she said. But know this, the Zelnaran Empire is not a weak nation. If you fail, it will be the end of you and your people. Elias nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. But there was something in her voice, something in her demeanor that told him she wasn't just testing his resolve, she was testing his courage. She wanted to see if he could back up his words with action. Understood, Your Highness, he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. I won't fail. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm on the horizon. Neither of them spoke for several long moments, until the sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. A Zelnaran advisor entered the room, whispering something to Liara. She nodded, then turned her gaze back to Elias. Your presence here may yet serve a purpose, Ambassador, she said. But do not mistake my words for kindness. We are not allies, not yet. Prove yourself, and we may consider a future where your people have a place in the galaxy. Elias felt the weight of her words, but there was something else there too, an opening. She hadn't rejected him outright. She was still considering the possibility, and that, for now, was enough. Thank you, Your Highness, he said, bowing slightly once more before turning to leave. As he exited the throne room, Elias' mind raced. He had made it through the first hurdle, but this was only the beginning. The path to peace would be long and filled with challenges, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. The future of his people depended on it. The days following the tense meeting in the throne room felt like a never-ending series of tests. Elias Darnell had made his mark on Princess Liara, but now the real work began. The Zelnaran Empire was not a place where words alone could sway minds. The history of the empire, the centuries of power and dominance, had made them wary of outsiders, especially humans with their boldness and brashness. Elias understood that. His mission was clear. He needed to earn the trust of the princess, and the ruling council if there was any hope of peace. In the days after their first encounter, Elias found himself in meetings with various council members, each one more intimidating than the last. The Zelnaran leadership was made up of brilliant minds, military strategists, politicians, and scholars. But what struck Elias most was the absence of empathy. These beings, who had been raised to think in terms of power and conquest, seemed almost incapable of understanding the concept of peace through cooperation. They saw the galaxy as something to be controlled, not shared. The meetings were a dance of words, each one carefully measured, each sentence calculated to avoid any misstep. Elias tried his best to keep his cool, presenting his case with logic and clarity, but every argument seemed to be met with resistance. They were all focused on the same thing, maintaining the Zelnaran Empire's superiority. Throughout it all, Princess Liara remained distant, her eyes rarely leaving him. At times, she seemed lost in thought, as though considering something much deeper than the surface discussions. Elias couldn't tell if she was trying to understand him or simply watching for weakness. Her silence was deafening, but he knew it was a challenge, one he had to face head-on. One afternoon, after yet another lengthy council meeting, Elias found himself standing alone in the grand gardens of the palace. The gardens were a marvel, stretching for miles in every direction. Trees with silver leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and exotic flowers glowed with an ethereal light. There was a quiet peace here, a stark contrast to the political tension inside the palace walls. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the stillness to wash over him. The quiet was a luxury, one he didn't often get, but it was in the midst of this calm that a sudden sound broke through the silence, the soft rustle of footsteps behind him. Elias turned to find Princess Liara approaching. She moved with the grace of someone who was used to being in control, her silver and blue gown flowing behind her like a stream of light. "You seek peace, Ambassador Darnell," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "But peace is not something that can be given. It is something that must be earned." Elias didn't answer immediately. He had learned that words with Liara needed to be chosen carefully, as she was a master of reading between the lines. Instead, he nodded slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "And I intend to earn it, Your Highness." Liara tilted her head slightly, studying him with those piercing eyes. "Do you really understand what that means? Do you know the weight of your words? Peace is not a gift. It is not a trinket to be bartered. It requires sacrifice, change, and not just on one side." Elias felt a tightening in his chest. He knew what she was saying. He had heard it in her tone, the warning beneath her words. "I understand," he replied. "I'm not here to offer empty promises. I'm here because I believe it is possible for us to work together. But that means both sides have to compromise, and both sides have to trust." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. For a moment there was silence between them, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Liara spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "The Zelnaran Empire has fought for everything we have. We have built this empire through strength, through war. And now you come here asking us to give it up, to share what we have with those who are not of our blood. You think this will be easy?" Elias shook his head. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I think the alternative is worse. If we continue on this path, we both lose. The galaxy loses. We're not enemies. We don't have to be." Liara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Elias standing alone in the garden. But he wasn't discouraged. He had seen a flicker of something in her, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. And that was all he needed for now. The next few days passed in a blur. Elias continued his meetings with the Zelnaran Council, presenting evidence of the economic benefits of peace, the potential for growth through mutual trade, and the long-term advantages of cooperation. But despite his best efforts, the Council remained largely unimpressed. They were skeptical, as expected. However, there was one thing he hadn't anticipated: the growing tension between the princess and the council. Liara, who had once remained silent during the discussions, was beginning to speak out more forcefully. She challenged the council's assumptions, pushing them to consider the long-term implications of their actions. It was a subtle shift, but Elias noticed it. Liara was beginning to see something in his words, something that even she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a leader in her own right. And though she wasn't ready to agree with him, Elias had earned a measure of respect from her. But peace was still far from certain. Then, one evening, a message arrived. It was from the Zelnaran military, a group of generals who had been pushing for war with the human colonies for months. They had made a bold move, attacking a small human outpost on the edge of Zelnaran space. The message was clear. This attack was not authorized by the princess, but it was a direct challenge to the peace talks. The generals had made their decision. They believed that war was the only way to restore the empire's dominance. Elias knew that this was the breaking point. If the attack was allowed to stand, all the progress he had made would be undone. The peace talks would collapse, and the galaxy would be plunged into war. He had to act quickly, and he had to convince Liara to act decisively. He immediately made his way to the royal chambers, where Liara had been meeting with her advisors. When he arrived, he found her standing by the large windows that overlooked the sprawling city below. The setting suns bathed the city in an orange glow, but there was no warmth in the princess's gaze. "They've made their move," Elias said, his voice firm. "The generals are forcing your hand, Your Highness. If we don't stop them now, there will be no peace." Liara turned to face him, her expression hardening. "I know," she said, "but I cannot act without the council's approval. I will not risk civil war within my own empire." Elias stepped forward, his heart racing. This was the moment. "Then let me speak to them. Let me show them that peace is worth the sacrifice. Let me show them that there is another way." For a moment, there was silence. Liara's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of doubt in her gaze. She was torn not just between two opposing factions, but between her duty to her people and her growing belief in the possibility of peace. Finally, she nodded, her voice low but steady. "You have one chance, Ambassador. Do not waste it." Elias didn't hesitate. He had been given a chance to make a difference, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He left the royal chambers with a single thought in his mind. He had to stop the war, no matter what. The council was already in session when Elias arrived. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The generals were there, seated at the table, their faces grim. Liara stood at the front, her eyes meeting Elias's as he entered. "I am not here to argue for or against war," Elias began, his voice strong and clear. "I am here to ask you to consider the cost, not just of human lives, but of everything we stand to lose if we do not find another way." He knew that this was his moment to change everything. If he could sway the council, he could change the future of the galaxy. But it wouldn't be easy. The generals were already set in their ways, their minds made up. But Elias' words were his weapon now, and he was going to use them. The tension in the council chamber was suffocating. Elias stood before the gathered members of the Zelnaran leadership, his heart pounding. His words had barely scratched the surface of the deep divide between the hawkish generals and the more moderate members of the council. But he knew this was the most important moment of his life. If he failed here, the galaxy would fall into war, and all his efforts to broker peace would have been in vain. Princess Liara stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Elias. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't let it distract him. His focus was entirely on the council, on the generals who were already murmuring in disagreement. He needed to win them over, not just with logic but with something more. He needed to reach them on a deeper level, to show them the consequences of their actions, to make them understand that war was not the solution. Elias took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice steady and firm. What we are facing here is not just a conflict between two species. This is about the future of the galaxy. If we let this war escalate, there will be no winners. There will only be ashes and memories of what could have been. We will destroy everything, our homes, our families, our legacies. Do you really want that? The room fell silent. The generals exchanged glances, their faces hard and unreadable. Some of the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of Elias' words hung in the air, but it was clear that not all of them were ready to accept it. The Zelnaran Empire had built its power on conquest, on the belief that the strong must dominate the weak. To suggest that peace was a viable option went against everything they had ever known. One of the generals, a tall and imposing figure named General Varak, stood up. His eyes were filled with contempt as he glared at Elias. "You speak of peace as though it's some kind of fairy tale," he said, his voice like gravel. "You think we can simply erase centuries of bloodshed and conquest with a few words. The Zelnaran have always ruled through strength, and now you want us to bow to the humans. You want us to give up everything we've fought for." Elias met Varak's gaze without flinching. "I don't want you to bow, General. I want you to think about what we're really fighting for. Is it pride? Is it territory? Or is it survival? The universe is changing. The Zelnaran Empire is not invincible. The longer we hold onto this old way of thinking, the more we will destroy until there is nothing left to conquer." Varak sneered, but Liara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "Enough, General," she said firmly, her eyes flashing. "I did not call this meeting for you to lecture us on the greatness of war." The generals fell silent at her words, and Elias could see that Liara's authority, though often quiet, was undeniable. She had the power to sway them, perhaps not all at once but slowly over time. He could feel her presence in the room, the way the others respected her, even if they didn't agree with her. She wasn't like the other leaders. She was different. And maybe, just maybe, Elias had finally reached her. Liara turned to the council, her gaze moving from one face to the next. "We are at a crossroads. The human ambassador has shown us a path where we do not have to destroy everything we've built. I know it is difficult to let go of the old ways, but if we do not change, we risk losing everything, including our own future. Do you want to be remembered as the generation that led us into destruction, or as the one that made peace possible?" Her words were quiet but powerful. They resonated with something deep inside Elias, and he could see that they were beginning to have an effect on the council. The generals remained still, but some of the more moderate members were nodding in agreement. Liara's leadership was more than just military strength. It was her ability to inspire, to see the bigger picture when others were lost in the details. She wasn't just a princess. She was a leader, a force to be reckoned with. Elias seized the opportunity. "You don't have to agree with everything I say, but I ask you to consider one thing. What is the cost of peace? What price are you willing to pay to ensure that the galaxy survives? I am asking you to take a chance, not just on the humans but on yourselves. You have the power to shape the future. You have the power to create something greater than just an empire built on war. I ask you to choose that future." The room was still. No one spoke for a long time, and for a moment, Elias thought he had failed. But then, to his surprise, it was not the generals who spoke, but one of the council members, a woman named Talira. She was an older member, known for her wisdom and her moderate views. She had been silent throughout the meeting, but now she rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room. "I have lived through the wars," Talira said, her voice soft but full of experience. "I have seen what happens when we let our pride drive us. We destroy everything in our path, and for what? For land, for resources, for control. And what do we gain in the end? Nothing but more enemies." She paused, looking out over the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the other council members. I was young when the last war ended. I was part of the delegation that negotiated the peace treaty with the Zaranites. We thought that war would solve everything, that it would make us stronger. But all it did was make us lose something precious, our humanity, our compassion. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Elias saw something change in the room. There was no immediate agreement, but there was a shift. The hard lines of the generals seemed to soften just a little. The moderates nodded, and even Liara seemed to take a deep breath, as though something had lifted from her shoulders. Talyra turned to Elias, her expression somber. I do not know if your vision of peace will work. I do not know if the humans will keep their word. But I am willing to listen. I am willing to try. Elias' heart leapt in his chest. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. The council wasn't ready to sign a peace treaty, not by a long shot, but they were beginning to consider the possibility. And for the first time in weeks, Elias felt a sense of hope. Liara stepped forward, her gaze shifting between Elias and the council. We will hold another session tomorrow. We will discuss this further. But know this, Ambassador, you have not won the council's favor yet. Your words were persuasive, but the Zelnaran are not easily swayed. You have a long way to go. Elias nodded, his mind racing. He hadn't expected instant results, but he knew that this was the beginning. If he could keep pushing, keep showing the Zelnaran that peace was not only possible but necessary, then they might just find a way to make it work. As the council disbanded, Elias found himself walking beside Liara. She didn't speak at first, but then she glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. You are not what I expected, Ambassador, she said quietly. Elias raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you expect? I expected someone who would only speak of war. Someone who would try to manipulate us with promises of glory and conquest, she replied. But you speak of something else. You speak of hope, and that is dangerous, Ambassador. I'm not here to make promises of glory, Elias said. I'm here to make a promise of peace. Liara's eyes softened, and for the briefest of moments, Elias thought he saw something like respect in them. But it was fleeting, and soon enough, her expression returned to its usual guarded state. Peace, she murmured. We will see. And as Elias walked away, he realized that for the first time in this entire mission, he wasn't just fighting for a cause. He was fighting for the future of two civilizations, for something bigger than himself, and that gave him strength. The next few days passed in a blur of tense discussions, sleepless nights, and careful diplomacy. Elias had hoped that the small shift in the council's attitude would be enough to push the peace talks forward, but the reality was far more complicated. The Zelnaran were a proud people, and though some of the council members had shown a willingness to listen, the hawkish generals remained a formidable obstacle. Every step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps back. Princess Liara had made it clear that she believed in the possibility of peace, but the pressure from her own people was growing. The generals were relentless, pushing for war with the human colonies. They argued that the Zelnaran Empire could not allow its power to be questioned, that the human expansion needed to be stopped before it became a threat to their sovereignty. Liara, though hesitant to take sides, knew that she couldn't afford to lose control of her empire. If she sided with Elias, it would be seen as weakness, and if she sided with the generals, the possibility of peace would be shattered forever. Elias found himself walking a fine line. His arguments for peace were clear, and he knew the stakes. But he also understood that the human colonies needed to be prepared for the worst, just in case the Zelnaran couldn't be swayed. He spent hours each day meeting with the human leadership, trying to keep them calm while still pushing for the agreement with the Zelnaran. He knew the moment the peace talks failed, everything would unravel, and the galaxy would be thrust into an all-out war. On the 3rd day after the council meeting, Elias was summoned by Princess Liara to meet her in private. He had been expecting this, and as he entered her private chambers, he found her sitting by a large window, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The soft light of the twin suns bathed the room in a warm glow, but there was a coldness in her demeanor. It was as though she was carrying the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders, and Elias could see the toll it had taken on her. "Ambassador Darnell," Liara greeted him without turning, her voice calm but laced with tension. "I have made my decision." Elias took a step forward, his heart racing. He had expected her to make a decision, but he didn't know if it would be the one he hoped for. He had worked so hard to build a bridge between their two peoples, and the thought of it all falling apart now felt unbearable. "I'm listening, Your Highness," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety he felt. Liara turned to face him, her sharp eyes studying him for a moment before she spoke. "I have decided to call for a final meeting with the Council. The generals have made their demands clear and I have heard their arguments, but I have also listened to your words and I cannot ignore them." Elias' pulse quickened. "And what does that mean?" "It means," she continued, "that I will give you one last chance to present your case. If you can convince the Council that peace is possible, that it is the only option that will ensure the survival of both our peoples, then I will side with you. But if you fail, if you cannot prove that your vision is more than just words, then I will have no choice but to stand with the generals and declare war." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Elias felt the full force of the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. The future of not just humans, but the Zelnaran as well, was in his hands. "I won't fail you, Your Highness," Elias said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I will prove that peace is not just possible but necessary." Liara nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I hope so, Ambassador, I truly do. But you must understand that this is not just about what we want. The Zelnaran have fought for everything they have. They are not going to simply give it up because of a few words. They need to see that this is more than just a temporary solution. They need to see that peace will ensure the future of our empire." Elias nodded, understanding the depth of her concern. He knew that this wasn't just about him or the humans anymore. It was about the very survival of the Zelnaran people, and he had to show them that peace wasn't just an idealistic dream. It was a practical, strategic choice. The following day, Elias stood before the council once again. The room was filled with tension and the generals were seated at the front, their faces hard and unmoving. Liara stood at the back, her eyes locked on Elias as he prepared to speak. The pressure was unbearable, but Elias had no choice. He had to make them believe. "I stand before you today not as a representative of Earth, but as a messenger of hope," Elias began, his voice steady as he addressed the council. "I understand the fear, the anger, and the pride that drives you. I understand that you see the human colonies as a threat, as a challenge to your empire's strength. But I ask you to consider this. What is the cost of continuing down this path?" The room was silent as Elias paused, his gaze sweeping across the council members. He saw the skepticism in their eyes, but he also saw something else, an openness, a flicker of doubt about the path they had been walking. He continued, pushing forward. "War is not the answer," he said. "War will only bring destruction, pain, and loss. It will tear apart everything you have built and leave nothing but a fractured empire. The human colonies are not your enemies. They are your allies, waiting to be brought into the fold of something greater than either of us. Together, we can build a future where both our peoples thrive. We can trade, share knowledge, and ensure that both the Zelnaran Empire and humanity have a place in the stars. But that can only happen if we choose peace." He could see the generals growing restless, but he pressed on, speaking from the heart now. "I know you don't want to be remembered as the generation that tore the galaxy apart. I know you don't want to be the ones who failed your people, but peace is not weakness. It takes strength to choose a path that will preserve life instead of destroying it. It takes courage to look beyond pride and fear and see the possibility of a better future." The council was still, and for a moment Elias thought he had lost them. But then one of the council members, a man named Councillor Ilian, stood up. He was an older man, known for his wisdom and cautious nature. He had been silent throughout most of the talks, but now he looked at Elias with a thoughtful expression. "I have spent my life serving the Zelnaran Empire," Ilian said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I have seen the wars, the bloodshed, and the loss. I have watched as our empire expanded, and I have watched as it began to rot from the inside. The truth is, we cannot continue as we have. The galaxy is changing, and we must change with it. The humans are not our enemies, they are our future." There was a murmur of agreement from the council, and Elias could feel the tide beginning to shift. The generals were still resistant, but the moderates were starting to see the truth of what he was saying. Liara's gaze softened, and for the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. "I believe in what you're saying, Ambassador," Ilian continued. "But the generals must be convinced. We cannot simply ignore the strength of our military. We must show them that peace is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. We must prove that it is the only way forward." Elias nodded. "I agree, but we can't wait forever. We must act now before it's too late." The council was still divided, but there was a sense of movement now, a sense that the possibility of peace was no longer out of reach. Elias could feel the weight of the moment, but he also felt a sense of clarity. This was his fight, but it was also Liara's, and the future of both their peoples depended on what they chose to do next. As the meeting came to an end, Liara stood up and addressed the council. "We will take a vote," she said, her voice commanding. "But know this, if we do not choose peace, we will be choosing war, and that is a choice none of us should take lightly." Elias met her eyes across the room, and for the first time he saw not just the princess, but the leader she was becoming. It wasn't just his battle now, it was theirs. And together they would fight for a future where peace was possible, no matter the cost. The council chamber was silent, a heavy weight hanging in the air. The Zelnaran leadership had just gathered for the final vote. Everything had led to this moment. The tense negotiations, the late-night discussions, and the long hours spent trying to convince the Zelnaran that peace was not just possible, but essential. Elias stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done everything he could. Now all he could do was wait. Princess Liara stood at the front, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. There was a sense of calm about her, but Elias could see the tension beneath the surface. She was a leader, yes, but she was also a daughter, a member of a people who had fought for centuries to maintain their power and influence. This decision wasn't just about the future of the Zelnaran Empire. It was about the survival of her people, and she knew the weight of it all. "I will now call for the vote," Liara said, her voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. "This is the final decision. If peace is chosen, we will begin a new path forward. If war is chosen, we will take the consequences of that path together." Elias could feel the eyes of the council members on him, their gazes calculating and uncertain. The generals were still present, their expressions cold, their bodies tense. They had fought for this moment, and it seemed unlikely they would back down now. But the moderates, those who had listened to Elias' arguments, were quiet, thoughtful. Some looked hopeful, others less certain. The vote was simple, a matter of raising hands for or against. As Liara called the names of the council members, each one responded with a raised hand or a shake of the head. One by one, the decision was being made. Elias watched each vote closely, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea what the outcome would be. It was still too close. The generals were the last to be called. General Varak, the leader of the war faction, stood tall, his expression hard as stone. When Liara called his name, he met her gaze with defiance. "I vote for war," he said, his voice ringing with certainty. "The Zelnaran Empire will not bow to the humans. We will not give up what is ours." Elias' stomach tightened. He had expected this, but hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality hit harder. Varak's vote alone could shift the council in his favor. The other generals followed suit, each raising their hand in favor of war. Elias could feel the room shifting, the weight of their opposition threatening to crush the fragile hope he had worked so hard to build. But then, something unexpected happened. Counselor Ilian, the elder member who had supported Elias' vision of peace, stood up. His voice was slow but firm as he addressed the council. "I have seen the cost of war," he said, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I have lived through the devastation it causes. We cannot afford to make the same mistake again. The humans are not our enemies. They are our future. I vote for peace." Elias felt a flicker of hope. Ilian's vote was a signal, a moment of clarity in the chaos. But it wasn't enough yet. The room was still divided, and the generals' votes outweighed those of the moderates. Then, to his surprise, a few more voices joined Ilian. Counselor Talira, the woman who had spoken out in favor of peace earlier, stood up, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I, too, vote for peace," she declared. "The Zelnaren have built their empire on war for too long. It is time for us to choose a different path, one that will ensure our future, not destroy it." One by one, more council members began to stand. Some were hesitant, others determined. It was as if the weight of Elias' words, of the vision he had presented, had finally reached them. One by one, the moderates raised their hands in favor of peace. Elias felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it wasn't over yet. The generals still held the majority. Finally, the last vote was called. Liara herself stood at the front, her gaze steady, but her eyes filled with emotion. She looked around the room, at the faces of her people, the faces of those who had fought so hard for the survival of the Zelnaren Empire. This decision, more than any other, was hers to make. She had to choose between the future of her people and the pride that had defined them for centuries. For a long moment, she stood in silence, her eyes meeting each council member's gaze. Then she spoke, her voice clear and filled with strength. "I vote for peace," she said. The room was still. The silence was deafening, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. The weight of Liara's decision hung in the air. The generals, the hardliners, the warriors who had shaped the empire were silent. There were no shouts, no protests. It was as if the weight of the moment had frozen them in place. Then, slowly, General Varak's hand dropped to his side. He looked at Liara with a mixture of disbelief and anger, but he said nothing. The decision had been made. Peace had won. The room, still heavy with the tension of the vote, began to stir as the council members processed what had just happened. Elias' heart raced. He had done it. Against all odds, against the stubborn resistance of the generals, he had convinced the Zelnaren leadership to choose peace. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet, but it was a monumental step forward. There was still much to do, many challenges to overcome. But for now, peace had prevailed. Liara turned to Elias, her gaze softening, and for the first time she smiled. "You did it, Ambassador," she said quietly. "You've shown us that there is another way." Elias felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew the real work was only just beginning. The vote had been won, but the task of building lasting peace would take time, effort, and understanding from both sides. They would need to address the underlying tensions, the historical animosities, and the very real concerns of both the Zelnaren and the humans. But for the first time, Elias believed that it was possible. As the council began to disperse, Liara approached him. Her expression was no longer cold or distant. There was warmth in her eyes, a flicker of something that Elias hadn't seen before. It wasn't just respect. It was something deeper, something that transcended diplomacy. "I thought I understood my people," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But this has shown me something else. It has shown me that we are not defined by our past. We are defined by what we choose to become." Elias nodded, knowing that this was a turning point, not just for the Zelnaren but for himself as well. He had come to this world with the sole purpose of securing peace, and now he had seen the possibility of something greater. He had seen the future. "You have a strong heart, Princess," Elias said quietly. "It was you who brought your people to this moment. I only showed them the way." Liara smiled again, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And you, Ambassador, have changed the course of history." For a moment the two of them stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling around them. The future was uncertain, and there would be challenges ahead. But they had taken the first step toward something bigger than both of them, something that could change the galaxy. As Elias left the council chamber, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the first victory had been won. And for now, that was enough.